Hello, I'm Jill Clark, former England international badminton player and now commentator for our dynamic and globally popular sport. This week, as we celebrate our 300th edition of Badminton Unlimited, I have something special for you, the story of badminton. It's believed that it all began about 2,500 years ago. While it's uncertain exactly how the shuttlecock came into existence, there are records of children in China playing with a similar looking toy. It had feathers attached to a base, and they'd kick it around for hours. This game was called Tizianzi, dating back to the 5th century BC. Still played today, it is now known as Jianxi in China, or Chapter around other parts of Asia. Historically, the shuttlecock was made of feathers, with rubber or cork attached to the base. Unlike in China, where the shuttlecocks were kicked, in Europe the game involved hitting it with wooden paddles, and later on with especially made rackets called battledores. Ancient Greece has been one of the originators for battledore and shuttlecock some 2,000 years ago. By the 17th century, le jeu du volant, exactly translated to the flying game, had become an aristocratic pastime. Those are the different stories around the origins of the traditional game, better known as battledore and shuttlecock. Here is what we know for sure. Badminton evolved from this ancient pastime.
Yeah, I think the game evolved from battledore and shuttlecock, and it's said that somebody had the bright idea of stringing some string across the hole in badminton, and instead of battledore and shuttlecock is just playing the shuttle backwards and forwards and hitting it to one another, you start to, when you put the string across, you start to hit the shuttle down and it becomes more competitive. And that's where I believe the badminton started.
The earliest documented reference to badminton was in 1863 in England. The Cornhill magazine describes badminton as battledore and shuttlecock played on sides, with a string used to cut across the middle.
Through modern technology of being able to go on to newspaper.com, we've discovered this article called "The Life in the Country House" was published in the Tuman's Exeter Flying Post, and this establishes that badminton was called Badminton in 1863, and it's published in this Cornhill magazine book. And it says that if the weather be such to as induce you to remain within doors, your cooperation will be sought for a game of pool, badminton, which is battledore and shuttlecock played with sides across a string suspended some 5 feet from the ground, or similar amusements.
Sometime in the second half of the 1800s, a similar game was gaining popularity in India.
We have a picture here of badminton being played in Simla in India. This is 1864, and you can see that it's a normal court as well, been marked out, and they're playing with quite large shuttlecocks as well. That's the earliest photograph we have of badminton being played in India. This is another photograph of badminton being played in 1867 in India. Well, you can see from that photograph there, in 1864, they were certainly using a net. It's slightly higher than 5 foot, but you can see they were using a net there. And again in 1867, They were using a net there. This is a photograph of badminton being played in Peshawar in India in 1874. You can see that the courts, it's well played because the courts are worn out. The grass is worn out there.
Evident through various texts and images, a game involving rackets and shuttlecocks with a net dividing the sides was popular among British officers in the city of Pune. In fact, this game came to be called Pune after the Indian city. Some believe the Pune game was where it all began.
But as far as the history goes and all that, I mean, where it started, as everybody probably knows, that it started somewhere in Pune, so they say.
The game originated in India, went back to England, got modified, and probably has become one of the most popular sports in the country now.
For me, of course, Pune is the name which we come. It was played by the Britishers when they were in here.
That's the general this thing. It started in Pune by some Britishers and the soldiers who used to play.
And there's a county called Badminton back in England, and that's where its name come from.
The Pune game was likely born at the Khaki Barracks in Pune, where officers in the British Army played the sport. The history of the Pune Club also dates back to the 1860s and was used by the military garrison stationed in the city. The sport was also played here. The Pune clubhouse and library were unfortunately destroyed by a devastating fire in August 1945, and with it any recorded evidence of its association with the sport. However, based on pictures that were being sent back to England, we can only imagine scenes like this. India in the late 19th century. Men and women serving the British Empire enjoying a game of Pune or badminton. Regardless of what it was called, what is undisputable is India's historical contribution to the popularity of the sport.
We know that for a fact that the game was started in Badminton House in 1863, but it wasn't very popular in this country for probably the next 10 years. It wasn't popular. It didn't grow very much at all, but it was taken, I believe, by army officers to India, and there it became extremely popular. We know with the civil service people who were out there, it became really popular. And then in about 1873, it started to come back to this country, and people in the paper were talking about this new game of badminton. But it had already been invented 10 years prior, but it certainly became more popular from 1873.
There were many variants of the game being played involving different types of court markings, net sizes, and the scoring system. By the early 1870s, the sport started to formalise, and in 1873, Major Forbes submitted a pamphlet published in Calcutta, which marked the first set of rules.
But the rules of badminton, which is Pune game, were formed in India only. In Pune, in Calcutta, Sialkot, then Chennai, everywhere the rules were formed. In Nagpur also the rules were formed. Likewise, that got amended every time. The size of the court was truncated in the center where you put the poles and net to open the doors to entry in the hall. The door should not obstruct the game. The game was played outside also, open air. But nowadays it is played in the hall.
My understanding is the game of badminton was played in Pune and in these military buildings, and they only had one entrance, and the entrance was in the side of the building, and that's why the net had to be reduced so people could get in and out of the hall. That's one theory.
The sport continued to grow and saw a boom when British Army officers and civil servants who played the game returned home. The reason why so many of them moved to the south of England to places such as Southsea and Bath was because it was warmer and they could continue playing outdoors.
There weren't, in those days, there weren't many halls to play the game. So that's why I believe in 1863 the game wasn't very popular here, because there were very few halls for it to play. So it had to be played outside, and it couldn't be played very often because of the wind and the cold weather. But it was slightly different in India. I think that it was played mainly outside in India. All the photographs that we've seen are people playing outside.
Time for a quick break, and when we come back, the story of how badminton got its name. Welcome back to our 300th episode of Badminton Unlimited, where we're looking at the story of badminton. Just to recap, the roots of the sport can be traced back to ancient Greece, China and India, and it developed from the sport of battledore and shuttlecock. So how did the name badminton come about?
Well, a lot of people don't realise, especially in this country as well, don't realise that the game, or the name of the game, came from Badminton House. The 8th Duke had daughters that played battledore and shuttlecock, we know that. And also the sons of the 8th Duke were in the Indian Army. So that could have been a way that the game of badminton, as it was discovered in 1863, was taken back to India.
Badminton takes its name from Badminton House. While it was referred to as the new game of badminton in 1873, like we said, the first documentation of the game badminton was published in 1863, and all corresponding evidence states that the game was already referred to as badminton.
What actually happened is somebody wrote in the Field magazine and said, what's happened to the old game of badminton? And the Field magazine eventually made it to India, and people wrote back. There was a letter written back home from the wife of the then Indian Foreign Secretary, the wife of the Foreign Secretary. She says in the letter, "Badminton mad here, making bats is quite a trade," and she says that it's very difficult to make the shuttlecocks here. This is an Indian racket made by Janzat Ji and Sons, Sialkot, Punjab, from the late 1800s. It's a one-piece racket that's bent round, and then there's a wedge piece put in there, and then it has a racket handle there in leather or chamois.
Here's something else that's interesting. The dimensions of the hall in Badminton House closely resemble the court measurements that we see being used in the sport of badminton today.
We've measured the hall, and it's basically the same size as the court as we know it now. Before the Badminton Association was formed, badminton clubs in this country certainly just used the size available. There was a court in Ealing Baths that was 60 feet by 30 feet. And when people came to play there, of course they struggled because the court was twice the size. And then the people from Ealing Bath went to play in a normal court, they would struggle as well.
Badminton clubs began to develop in England in the 1870s and 80s, and it was Southsea and Bath that were the oldest clubs. So with the sport becoming competitive, and in order to regulate it, the first National Badminton Association was formed here in England in 1893.
This is the framed picture of the start of the Badminton Association in 1893, and Colonel Toby put an advert in the Field magazine inviting all clubs to attend on September in 1893, and in the end 9 clubs turned up and they agreed to start the Badminton Association, and they also formed the first official rules of the game, which are very similar to the rules today. Colonel Doby was he was the first president, secretary, treasurer of the Badminton Association, and he was the one who actually got it going. George William Vidal, and he was an instigator of composing the rules in India. He was a British civil servant there, and he eventually moved back to England, and he became the secretary of the Badminton Association in England from 1899 to about 1907. I believe that was a major change in the game of badminton. For the first, from 1863 until 1893, there were no rules, no regulations at all, and clubs just simply played friendlies in the country. And this was a major change. And that Badminton Association then sort of organised badminton in the world until 1934, when the IBF, the International Badminton Federation, was formed. So I think that actually starting the association in 1893 was really the major thing in badminton. It's when it started to grow, be promoted.
The equivalent of the Big Bang of badminton took place in 1898. Mr. Percy Buckley, secretary of the Guildford Badminton Club, organised the first ever open doubles badminton tournament. The Guildford tournament was the first open tournament in 1898. Because of its success, the Badminton Association organised its first event the following year, including the 2 singles competitions to the doubles.
In 1898, the first open tournament was played at Guildford. When I say open, this is where people from other clubs were allowed to play there. And it was so popular, this tournament, that the next year the Badminton Association ran their own tournament. For the first few years it was called the Association Tournament, and then it was called the All England. And one of the major things about the promotion and why lots of clubs wanted to join was because of the All England Badminton Championships. You see the number of clubs vastly increased as soon as the All England started. My first interest in the history of badminton was when somebody sent me a photograph of the 1904 All England, and it is the first photograph of the All England. But on the history side, it was when somebody sent this 1904 All England, and I got interested in the history, and then eventually I joined the museum and have been involved in the Badminton Museum for the last 19 years or so. This one here is of a house in Sheldon, in Teignmouth in Devon, and this is the house where the first All England champion lived. And we believe because they could practice badminton outside, this is why the Devon girls were so good. There was 4 of them in the final, and they never lost a game in the first All England right the way through. And you can see they're particularly good because you can see that they're doing jump smashes here and round the head action shots there in their long dresses. And this is actually Muriel Lucas here, who's actually playing. And she was so much stronger, she usually played at the back of the court. Quite a few of the photographs we have where she's playing at the back of the court. And there she is again there at the back of the court. This guy here is Stuart Massey, who was the first All England champion. And this chap here is Ralph Nichols, and he is the last Englishman to win the All England.
From, let's say, at the age of 15, when I first won the national junior title, it was always my ambition to win the All England title, because in those days World Championships was not there. In the early 70s, Olympics, it was not included. So All England was like the unofficial World Championship, equivalent of Wimbledon in tennis. So whoever won the All England was considered as the unofficial world champion. So everybody, dream, in any badminton player's dream at that time was to win the All England. It was very prestigious.
It's known to be one of the prestigious tournaments of the year. In fact, the best. If you won the All England, you were...
It's the oldest tournament, the main reason, but it was also considered up to 1977 as the unofficial World Championships. There weren't any World Championships. So if you won the All England before that date, you were considered the best player in the world.
The first 2 All England events were called the Badminton Association Tournament, and it was considered the unofficial World Badminton Championships until 1977, when the International Badminton Federation launched the official World Championships. This year here in Basel, we celebrate the 25th staging of the Badminton World Championships. It's taken 2,000 years since its origin and more than 150 years since the inception as a sport to get to where we are today. The second highest participation sport in the world, with a truly global following at the elite level. What a fascinating and glorious journey for the sport I love. Until the next time, bye-bye.